This is part of a project that I started a couple of years ago, but actually I'm halfway through with a book on this one. And that's a way of reconnecting with the topic. I had to interrupt to other things. I don't have handouts because I want to save the trees, and so if anyone would be interested in this piece of paper, I'm happy to forward emails, so electronic copies. Like most early Christian intellectuals, Clement adhered to the principles of classical education, paideia, or as he would put it, paideia, which presupposed a gradual initiation into the art of thinking and living, whose goal was to shape the aspirant into a superior, noble being. In order to attain this goal, one had to progress through the stages of a threefold curriculum of Platonic inspiration, from ethics to physics to epoptics, or from virtuous formation to contemplation of nature and the vision of transcendent realities. The formative dimension notwithstanding, Clement's paideia emphasized the acquisition of knowledge, including that of the universe, of immediate interest here. In what follows, I discuss aspects pertaining to his complex approach to reality within the framework of the Platonic curriculum and what he called gnostic tradition. A peculiarity of his approach is that he considered the experience of holiness and the knowledge of the universe as inextricably connected with the Gnostic tradition. Correspondingly, his depiction of the holy Gnostic or the Christian saint included, alongside aspects of holiness, a complex representation of reality, visible and invisible, created and uncreated, circumscribed from a variety of disciplinary viewpoints. Against this backdrop, Clement developed the second stage of the Platonic curriculum, which is physics, into another triadic pattern. Specifically, and without saying it openly, he worked out a contemplative approach which proceeded from the scientific description of the natural phenomena to the ecclesial translation to their view from a divine vantage point. The first stage of this contemplative program, analytical, consisted in assimilating solid scientific information as an antidote for confusion and ignorance. The second stage, hermeneutical or interpretive, referred to making sense of the cosmos within a scripturally based, faith-conditioned Christian setting. The third stage went beyond analysis and interpretation, being the exclusive province of the holy Gnostic, who was able to perceive the cosmos through the transformed eyes of one in touch with the divine. By developing the second stage of the Platonic curriculum, Clement erected a true contemplation of nature built upon the realistic appraisal of nature, which no longer treated the cosmos as a stepping stone for chasing after the divine. Contemplation made use of a range of curricular sciences and viewpoints, for which reason I contend it amounted to an innovative interdisciplinary take on the classical tradition of natural contemplation. That's the anchoring, but also innovation, whatever your buzzwords. In what follows, I consider first Clement's understanding of Gnostic tradition as a framework for contemplation. Second, the profile of the holy Gnostic. And third, Clement's developed construct of natural contemplation. So Gnostic tradition and natural contemplation, which is very, very interesting, because to be committed to tradition doesn't usually entail to become very much interested in the sciences of the time, but that's another story. That's his peculiarity. Borrowing from the classical curriculum, Clement discerned within the Christian experience various stages of initiation, which corresponded to as many levels of awareness and perception. The context within which the various levels were attainable was what he called Gnostic tradition, or again, holy gnosis, or even further, ecclesiastical gnosis, by which he understood an authenticated as well as authenticating frame of reference. By the way, most of my references are to Stromatis, Miscellanies, and Eclogae Propheticae, so prophetic selections. In the parameters of holy gnosis became possible, for instance, the advancements from a naive, undeveloped faith and preconceived ideas to a mature, certified knowledge and wisdom. In the same framework, advancement from faith to knowledge entailed a contemplation that strengthened the faith, giving it depth and breadth. Furthermore, it entailed familiarization with the disciplinary areas of science, theology, and philosophy. The outcome of this process was the polymath Gnostic. Nevertheless, following the classical paideia, Clement construed Gnostic initiation as training for life, It was a complex, holistic process of becoming which included existential as well as intellectual aspects. Its final outcome was not only the polymath sage, it was also the holy Gnostic, whose accomplishments in terms of personal virtue intensified the breadth and his or her grasp of reality. And when I say his, her, I'm not just paying tribute to whatever the trend. He actually pointed out in a couple of instances that the Gnostic can be either male or female, which is very interesting for a second century guy. Regarding the process of initiation, it advanced from catharsis, purification, and the change of life to the little mysteries of the teaching or training, and from the latter to the great mystery of natural contemplation and epoptics, divine vision. This terminology evokes the mystery religions, but Clement's program did not follow the usual sequence, namely from beginning to perfection, a one-way trajectory. For instance, the preliminary status of the earlier steps did not mean that after a while they became obsolete. Personal worthiness and the skills acquired during the preparatory stages continued to perform important functions even when the seeker reached epoptics, the higher status. According to Clement, Abraham, taken to epitomize the Gnostic experience, kept studying astronomy even after he came to know God. And Clement made a lot of fuss about the original name, Abram, and according to him, that would mean, I have no idea of Hebrew or Semitic languages, so forgive me for that scene, Scott. But according to Clement, thank you, that meant father whose mind was lost in the clouds or something like that. Well, that's his etymology, I guess. And for him, that amounted to being an astronomer. And when when Abraham met God, had the revelation, he received another alpha, he says, another A in his name, and alpha being the first number in the Greek alphabet and many other alphabets of the ancient times. That was, a code for God. And therefore, Abram, the astronomer, became Abraham, the seer of God, the theologian, that is. Awesome stuff. From my viewpoint, anyway. Okay, where is that? I lost the plot. Yeah. Faith, as we shall find out soon, was not only one of the fundamentals of the process, it was also in its mature form a way of thinking. That the process was not one way becomes obvious in that its final epoptic stage was off the charts. It was neither about learning nor about purification. Learning and purification led to it and were ever required to maintain Gnostic aptitude, but the epoptic exercise transcended both. It was the stage when the holy Gnostic grasped reality more fully, in divine-like fashion, beyond the veils of ignorance and misrepresentation, as well as beyond learning. It was a state of, I quote, eternal and unchanging contemplation. As Clement had it somewhere, epoptics was wisdom divine, pure light which enlightens those who are pure, securing the comprehension of the truth. Narrowing down its meaning to suit our purposes, epoptics amounted to contemplating and comprehending the great mysteries of the universe. All these are quotations. In the light of the primary meaning of everything that is. The primary meaning, or the inner measure of reality, as he says in Exhortation, was not an impersonal law of nature. It was the supreme object of contemplation, the source of Gnostic tradition, the Son of God who granted and revealed the understanding of the universe of things that are and will be. Epoptics, in fact, the entire framework of Gnostic tradition was therefore about grasping the creation together with its creator, Christ, Son of God, always create a figure in Clement. It amounted to a perception of reality from a theological, Christ-centered vantage point. The above summary brings to the fore that Gnostic tradition and the contemplation of nature were inseparable for Clement. In a description of the progress of the faith from false assumptions to the truth, he noted that faith had as main object the true understanding of things visible, namely the physical universe. In his words, traveling through the beings accessible to the senses, faith leaves behind all assumptions about reality and presses forward towards an authenticated knowledge of things to reside into the truth. So understood, faith was not a blind, passive acceptance of a given information. It evolved and became active, subjecting the information to scrutiny. It became an intellectual tool, elsewhere called scientific contemplation. Well, how you can call faith scientific contemplation, but there you go. That's what faith becomes in Clement. By the way, if interested, it's in the 7th book of Stromatis, chapter 16, paragraph 102, which operated according to the rules of classical dialectic, or similarly to the scientific reason of modern times, a tool by which the mind investigated reality in search for an indisputable and authenticated knowledge of the universe. What matters is that Clement connected faith, tradition, and the comprehension of reality. After all, Gnostic tradition amounted to the science and understanding of the beings that are, will be, and have been, together with the manner in which they are, will be, and have been. He kept repeating this. Being connected to the wisdom of tradition, the holy Gnostic was able to know and comprehend everything. This was so because Christ, whose teaching constituted the foundation of Gnostic tradition, revealed to the seeker what the created beings presently are, what the future things will be, and how the things that have been brought into being came to be. So the third occurrence of this phraseology, it's in the 6th book of Stromatis, chapter 9, paragraph 78. In other words, Gnostic tradition represented a repository of authenticated information about reality as a whole, from beginning to end, a holistic perception of the cosmos in its dynamic development from the past to the present and the future. But supreme knowledge required fellowship with Christ, or tapping into the mind of the Son of God who understood everything. Training, Clement iterated, was insufficient. And I turn now to how the holy Gnostic worked out the contemplation of nature. In his seminal work on Clement's philosophical background, Salvatore Lilla, 1971, proposed that the Clementine Gnostic preferred the invisible or intelligible to the visible or sensible side of reality. This understanding, shared by a range of scholars, is unilateral. As Matteo Monfrinotti recently pointed out, his book 2015, Clement depicted the holy Gnostic as profoundly interested in the cosmos, and not only as a stepping stone for contemplating the divine. It is true that the Clementine Gnostic yearned above all else, I quote, the wisdom of the maker and teacher of all, which is the knowledge of the Son of God. But this yearning did not entail a preference for what is beyond the world. To prioritize the knowledge of Christ was to listen to the teacher of all the created beings, whose wisdom conditioned the Gnostic grasp of reality. It was a matter of learning about the universe from its very maker, who knew all things from before the foundation of the cosmos. Clement's holy Gnostic sought, therefore, to know Christ through contemplating the universe, and to know the universe through knowing Christ. So understood, grasping the invisible through and beyond the visible was a stage in the contemplation of the cosmos. Clement believed that the main challenge for the Gnostic was to make sense of what reality actually was. He shared in the skepticism of the ancients about the information mediated by the senses and the preconceived notions pertaining to common sense. He therefore despised any knowledge based on untested opinion, which he described as drowning the soul's vision in the hazy ignorance pertaining to a worthless way of life. I think I did him justice in translating this one. In turn, he believed in solid education and, above all, in the Gnostic quest, which entailed one's intellectual and personal progress. Training and transformation furthermore facilitated the discernment of the true nature of things. What matters is that the holy Gnostic, to look at this matter from another angle, was very educated, not only a virtuous person. Curricular training had much to do, in fact, with the Gnostic agenda of making sense of the universe. Emulating the ranging education of Moses, and he describes Moses quite at length, being schooled by the Egyptians, then some Greeks in Egypt, and finally by the Chaldeans. Very interesting stuff. So we went to various universities. The Clementine sage had to undertake a complete training, which included the disciplines of music, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, dialectic, and philosophy. So it took a while to become a sage. This equipped the polymath Gnostic with indispensable skills for the exploration and understanding of reality. But natural contemplation was not reducible to a scientific exploration of the cosmos. The usefulness of the sciences notwithstanding, particularly astronomy, the Gnostic was not interested in making sense of the world and natural phenomena in separation from the creative source of the universe. This understanding required, alongside the classical curriculum, theology. Clement found no contradiction between faith and reason or theology and the sciences, which, in his views, worked like faith and dialectics similarly and synergistically. For example, the purpose of astronomy was not opposite to theology. Together with studying the universe's form, the bearing of the sky, and the movement of the stars, the task of astronomy was to bring the soul closer to the creative power. Thus, the study of nature advanced from assessing the beauty and harmony of the cosmos to the consideration of its intelligible principle, and from the latter to the contemplation of their divine source, namely the Logos. And this is a beautiful passage, I won't be reading it, where he deals with Abraham's journey to Mount, I think, Moriah, he calls it, the 3-day journey and ending with a failed sacrifice of Isaac. And Clement takes the 3 days of the journey as signifying the 3 stages. He Hellenized the Hebrew scriptures immensely. Do I do well? Or still have some time? Meaning? 10?
About 15 minutes.
Oh, awesome. The study of nature advanced from assessing the beauty of the cosmos to the consideration of its intelligible... Oh, I read that one, sorry. The study of the physical world included its metaphysical cause. As Eric Osborne noted, Clement inherited an understanding of physiologia. Physiology was physics, discourse on nature, that no longer meant knowledge of the natural world solely. In his day, the natural sciences referred to, and I quote from Osborne, to an interpretation of natural phenomena as signs of transcendent reality. That's from his book, Clement of Alexandria, 2005. Clement's rendition of the progress of Abraham from astronomy to theology is the best illustration of this approach. Again, I'll not read the passages. It is in this light that Clement's repeated point about the limitations of the naturalistic approach, deprived of theological insight, should be understood. For him, the contemplation of the universe necessarily began by describing the nature of things, to then ascend towards God by way of theological insight. But this upwards theocentric journey of the holy Gnostic, facilitated by astronomy and other curricular disciplines, was not the only way to make sense of reality. The holy Gnostic could approach knowledge from the opposite point as well. This approach took divine vision, theology, faith, and scriptural revelation as the vantage point from which unfolded a downwards, cosmocentric view of the universe as perceived through the eyes of God, and those of a godlike being, indeed the holy Gnostic. This downwards schema features, for example, in the statement that God's descent on Mount Sinai revealed the workings of the providential divine power which ruled over the whole of the cosmos. That's in the 6th book of Stromatis, chapter 3, 32. In the same vein, Clement pointed out elsewhere that by contemplating the first cause and the cause engendered by it, namely the Father and the Son, the Gnostic was given the opportunity to, I quote, firmly grasp the stable, unchangeable, and immovable principles of beings and know the truth of the creation in its entirety from the establishment of the world to its end. Same book 6, chapter 9, 78. Here the preference of Clement for the theologically informed worldview is unmistakable. Obviously, that was a Trinitarian viewpoint on cosmology. Yeah? So you contemplate the Father and the Son, the cause and the cause that was engendered by the first cause, and you got information or revelation in relation to the principles of beings and whatever the functioning of the universe. Far from eschewing it, both approaches, upwards and downwards, consider the cosmos an object of Gnostic contemplation. In this light, the holy Gnostic was supposed to seek God through the multidisciplinary exploration of the universe and understand reality from the vantage point of God. Well, this is where I guess the followers of Salvatore Lila are wrong, because they look at the Platonic schema and they don't see that Clement operated, so it's anchored. So it's a Platonic schema, but Clement operated very creatively with that schema, to the extent that this upwards journey described by the schema was actually complemented by this downwards revelational kind of Semitic, if you like to put it, or scriptural kind of approach to cosmology, where the cosmos was not lost, was just perceived from two different vantage points. There is nothing here to support Lila's view. Well, there you go, I already have it there. That the Gnostic made use of curricular sciences only in order to sever any ties with the body, the earth, and the visible reality as a whole, to just be absorbed in the contemplation of the divine. As he was not against the sciences, Clement was not against the cosmos either, which he represented as harmoniously structured and theologically meaningful. The use of curricular disciplines for transcending material reality was perhaps the strategy of a Platonic mystic. However, due to his interest in the exploration of the universe, Clement exhibited an eminently Christian mindset, albeit one that expressed itself in Platonic idiom. Why I call it Christian? It's scriptural, revelational. Clement proved time and again his interest in the cosmos as God's creation, a sacred place full of divine symbols, and not only in the Creator towards whom these symbols pointed. He consistently depicted the Holy Gnostic as an assiduous explorer of nature. The Holy Gnostic actively engaged the cosmos in order to know it and the beings within it, an effort which resulted in what Clement termed the soul's vision of beings, whether of the one or the many, which culminated in making sense of the universe in its entirety, and so on and so forth. I think I'll skip to the last bit, which is actually the topic. Contemplating nature in 3 steps. All the above have provided us with the necessary background for making sense of Clement's innovative approach to natural contemplation as a structured process, as rigorous as the Platonic curriculum which it developed. Returning to the outlines presented in the introduction of this paper of his developed schema of natural contemplation, Clement prescribed an advancement from description to interpretation to vision. The first stage corresponded to physics and cosmology, by and large incorporating all that the ancient physiologoi, physicists, had to say about nature. The second stage required the ecclesial assimilation of the scientific description of the cosmos, its interpretation from the viewpoint of the scriptural doctrine of creation and in view of the faith. These initial stages were readily available to any Christian who was trained scientifically and advanced in the faith. So anyone, people like me, could do those first 2 stages. The third stage, however, was accessible only to the Holy Gnostic, the perfect polymath, who likewise attained perfection, holiness, being in touch with the divine. This last stage amounted to the aptitude of a divine bird's-eye view, where the Holy Gnostic was able to make sense of the whole and the parts, the past, the present, as well as the future of the universe. I tried to find a very, as clear as possible reference to this final stage in Clement, so far unsuccessfly, so there's hints about it, but elsewhere the stuff, the famous vision of Saint Columba, according to Dovnan, it's an ecstatic perception of reality where all the parts of the universe appear unified, as a single ray of the sun. I believe that would be a very good complement to what Clement says about the Gnostics' perception of reality. For some reason, Clement has never delineated this process, the 3-stage or triadic pattern in the new triadic pattern, has never delineated this process as such, but the 3 stages of natural contemplation can be identified throughout the corpus of his writings, particularly in Stromatis and prophetic selections. In my reconstruction, the first stage included a consistent methodology worthy of the name of science. And I had an argument with scientist about this. Nothing before the 20th century can be called science. Well, now I'll give you the outlines of the first stage, and you tell me if it's scientific or not, methodologically speaking. Clement began from the premise that nature can be described, but not understood, at least not fully. The difficulty originated in subjective and objective causes, namely the uncertainties of the mind and the complex aspect of reality. It is the latter that conditions the articulation of our knowledge of the universe in terms of unity and difference. After a fashion, gnosis is the science of what differs and what is unitary within nature. Also the science of how within the totality of the universe all the parts differ from one another, whilst they maintain a relation with the whole. The first book of Shromat is 1357. A typical example of analysis leading to the realization of cosmic diversity refers to the Aristotelian division of reality into the earthly zone and the celestial area of the physical universe. A typical example of synthesis leading to the realization of cosmic unity refers to the scientific discovery that all the beings within the universe are made of the same material stuff. Given these examples, it is obvious that the first stage of natural contemplation presupposed awareness of the sciences and the ability to deploy scientific tools in the exploration of the universe. The second stage consisted in the interpretation of the scientific view of the universe within the framework of scriptural theology, or more broadly, the ecclesial mindset. I shall provide here three illuminating examples, well, at least from my point. The movement of cosmic nature from the state of darkness to light, so Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, or from chaos to order was analogous to Christians' baptismal passage from death to life. The ecclesial experience of rebirth reiterated the original ecosystemic event, which resulted in the ordered universe, and in so doing worked as a hermeneutical lens which described cosmogony as anticipating spiritual anthropogony. In turn, the latter gave the full measure of the universe's destiny. So understood, furthermore, the cosmos could have been legitimately represented in the light of scriptural books such as Genesis, Daniel, and the Psalms as a continuous doxology addressed to the Creator. That's the second example. The third one. Last but not least, perceived as a theophany, the cosmos mediated the seeker's touch with the divine, much like an icon does. In Clement's words, through contemplating things created, the holy gnostic reveres the energy and will of God. Finally, as I have pointed out earlier, acquiring the mind of Christ, who, as the cause and the measure of all things, possessed the knowledge of the universe, fully transformed, the holy gnostic acts as the way the Son of God perceived reality, being endowed with the capacity to catch at a glance the parts in the whole, the present as well as the past and the future of the cosmos. Thus, in the Clementine schema of natural contemplation, the preliminary stages offered an idea of the universe entirely based on human effort and knowledge. This corresponded to the upwards progress earlier mentioned. In turn, the third stage corresponded to the downwards revelational movement being associated with extrasensory and or ecstatic experiences. Whereas the first two stages bridged what we would call today science and theology, the first step transcended both and had no correspondent in them. It was entirely the province of the holy Gnostic. To conclude, Clement was a traditional Christian thinker committed to what he called Gnostic tradition or ecclesiastical gnosis, but also a very educated man, equally committed to the principles of classical paideia, which he articulated along the lines of the Platonic curriculum. The latter was a tripartite algorithm which prescribed advancement from ethical formation to natural contemplation of the supreme vision. Central to the Clementine system was the figure of the Christian saint, dubbed Holy Gnostic, whose prefigurations were scriptural figures such as Abraham and Moses. But the Holy Gnostic preserved likewise all the features of the classical sage and the Platonic mystic, which he or she combined with the faith-based scriptural notion of holiness. A polymath and a perfect person, the Holy Gnostic was deeply interested in making sense of things, not only of God. Contrary to modern assessments that Clement's sage gazed beyond the world, seeking divine horizons, in the foregoing, I pointed out that, albeit theologically committed, the Holy Gnostic illustrated a contrary view, being fully engaged in the analysis and understanding of the world. Clement's development of the Platonic natural contemplation into another triadic pattern description, interpretation, and vision, these are the stages summarized, is sufficient proof that the experience of the Holy Gnostic was not about escaping the universe. It was about making full sense of it by way of disciplinary tools, ecclesial perceptions, and the ability to survey all things divinely. This rigorous schema of natural contemplation proves Clement's ingenious take on the classical system, his capacity to innovate within the established tradition.
Thank you, Doru. We have about 13 minutes for questions.
Should I go? Should I go? Stay, go, whatever.
I was interested in this idea of faith as scientific contemplation. I'd be interested to know what terminology was used for scientific contemplation.
Theoria epistemoniki. So, I translated as literally as I could.
So then, what is the contemplation of?
Well, he applies this only to natural things. So, in this context,
not to be of God, because you're not supposed to get the sort of knowledge of God that you could get there.
Yeah.
But then you also want to say near the end that nature wasn't something that could be known either. So what sort of knowledge is allowed for this form of faith?
Yeah. First of all, is the idea of making sense of things as described by the available sciences. So I found this fascinating because he didn't come up with that kind of narrative. You know, we Christians are the best. You pagans, stupid. You don't know anything. All contradictions and that. You know. Yesterday about contradictions. He said, look, the physicists of the time have said this and that about nature, the phenomena, celestial spheres, and so on and so forth. And we have to accept that as a given, unless we are scientists ourselves and we can challenge that description to produce a better one. What I found fascinating is the fact that he said faith is neither against this description of reality, nor a replacement of it, nor again indifferent. Faith is the way the mind operates in a converted person. And I was happy to find this thing in the sixth book of Stromatis, because it reminded me of my former love, Maximus the Confessor. There's a similar definition towards the end of the Mystagogy, where faith is not the acceptance of something, or preaching, or gospel, something. No, faith is the form in which a converted mind functions. In other words, the mind preserves all its properties, analytical aptitude, and so on and so forth. But it interprets things in a way that makes sense in a Christian system. And now I come to, if I got right your question, or the first part of it, it's not a matter of not knowing entirely. It is a matter of accepting a given description. Maybe we cannot understand the ins and outs of the phenomena, and you would say today Clement would be thrilled to see that we know a bit more about the workings of the natural world. Yeah. His point was, even though we don't make sense of how things work, we still can articulate this knowledge, this description of reality, in a way that places this or makes legitimate this description within a Christian system, scripturally based. In other words, we allow the scientists to describe reality the way they can, but we'll try to interpret this reality or make sense of it in Christian terms as God's creation, bearing all the marks of providence and stuff like that.
I was wondering if you could talk more about, once the Gnostic has achieved this true vision of the world, how is that vision of the world related to the vision of God? So it's more about like the larger three stages. And is this possible? Because if it's just a step in the stage, it in and of itself is not possible really to achieve, then what hope do we have to go to stage 3?
Well, as I said, he uses the curriculum, but in his peculiar way. In reality, all the stages are mutually included. So typically Platonic trajectory, ethics, physics, epoptics, or divine vision, they include one another. My understanding, however, is that the third stage is not the byproduct of the previous two.
Okay.
So, in theory, the third stage can occur at any point of one's journey.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that is surprising.
Well, because, for instance, you cannot draw the line and say, I have become virtuous.
Yeah.
Yeah? Or draw the line and say, I've got all the knowledge of the universe. So these are ongoing processes. And unfortunately, I had to skip passages in that. He has a nice passage on Abraham. Abraham was already in touch with the divine, but he still studied astronomy. Of course, that's his take on Abraham. We don't see any of it in Genesis, yeah. But from his viewpoint, Abraham was the epitome of the holy Gnostic. Someone in touch with the divine and yet studying. And what's the report between these? Well, you can become like me, interested in the universe, for instance, okay, without being a holy Gnostic. Meaning what? You'll have an understanding of how things may work, in the natural world, but you'll miss something fundamental, which would transform that knowledge into a Christian take on the universe. The Gnostic is the only person that can have that full image of the universe together with its creator. Intellectual, I know that there is a creator, and in theory that I can discover marks of the divine workings, in the creation. But in reality, I haven't seen it. The Gnostic is in touch with the divine, and therefore can see that. In other words, there's a complementarity between these stages. And when one actually is in touch with the divine, has a broader, more encompassing view of the universe, but together with the creator. If you like, it's more like developing a divine kind of sense perception, which is something that pops up in later ascetic literature after him.
Okay. Is that good for now, or we have a couple of...
I was just curious why you would want to do it then if it doesn't actually lead you to the highest thing that you're really aiming at, namely the contemplation of God.
Well, the thing is, that's something that I found really interesting about Clement. You desire God for God's self, but there's also some kind of utilitarian approach to that divine vision, because you know that only when you reach God you can make sense of the universe. In other words, you do love the universe, you are interested in the universe and want to make sense of it, and therefore only by reaching God you can make sense of the universe.
Funny priority. Okay.
So it's not the typically Platonic kind of whatever it's described.
Now, Tune, did I see a hint from you earlier?
No, I leave that to them.
Okay, then David, I believe I saw you.
This is partly related. Earlier you said that Clement adapts and creatively adapts the Platonic schema. Of course, it seems to be a lot of what you're saying has a relation to the famous ladder image in the Symposium, where you begin at lower, or at least I think this is what Plato says, you begin at lower stages of contemplation, which would presumably include include contemplation of concrete things and things in nature, and then you sort of build your way up to contemplation of the truly unknowable divine realities, the good, and so on and so forth. How is what Clement is saying different from that genuine schema? Is it part of what you were saying here that there actually is no consecutive stepwise ladder approach? Or what else is different for Clement?
Well, the fact that he developed the second stage of physics is, I believe it's his contribution, but it's based on previous contributions. For instance, one of the things that Plato didn't have was Aristotle. So the physics of Plato is not the physics of Aristotle, yeah? Whereas the first stage of Clement's physics is very Aristotelian, it's that rigorous description, rigorous methodology in approaching the phenomena and all that. So itself, you can say, okay, with the Neoplatonists they have tried to do that, but he actually predates the Neoplatonists.
No, I understand it's different in content, but is the form different? Is the form of the content?
Well, I think he gave structure to the second stage.
Mm-hmm.
So, I repeat, I couldn't find any passage where he puts it plainly, but throughout the corpus, you see references to different stages within the second stage. And I believe that he, at least in his mind, there was this structure, from go from a description, natural description of reality to sort of a Christian way of making sense of it, and then the divine bird's eye view, which I couldn't find elsewhere.
I wanted, if it's okay, then can I ask you about that divine bird's eye view? That's interesting to me because it seems like there are two different things going on. One is that in the final stage, which is either a divine perspective or epoptics proper, you have a contemplation of God. But the other way of thinking about what you just described is you have God's perspective on the natural world, which is actually sort of oppositely oriented.
Yep.
Either you're seeing God properly or you're seeing as God sees. And maybe they're the same thing, but I wonder if you could comment on that. And second, I wonder if you relate this at all to Clement's rather interesting contribution of his interpretation of faith, hope, and love as a three-stage ascent from, in terms of motivation for doing good, right? Faith is to view God as, to be afraid of God's punishments. Hope is to hope for God's rewards. And love is to do it for the sake of God. The first is proper to a slave, the second to a servant, the third to a son. This has wide-ranging influence, but I wonder if that maps here?
Or a mirror.
Or is a mirror? Oh, sorry.
Maybe a mirror in the ethics, the first phase.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like a development of the first stage in a triadic pattern. That way we can complement my research. I'm not interested in ethics. I'm not an ethical person.
Well, I guess that answers that. Okay.
But no, yeah. But definitely, yeah. I go swimming tomorrow, so sorry for the conference at Macquarie. He definitely was a Platonist in that he used a lot these triadic patterns.
Yeah.
And I'm certain you can find even in the third stage of the classical pattern you can find degrees. Personally, why I was and I'm still interested in this second stage. It's because he's usually perceived as one that would quickly run away from the cosmos to meet his God. And I don't think that's the case, particularly because he embraced Aristotelian naturalism. That's so Christian of him, I guess, because Christians had, at least initially, a very incarnational take on reality, and I believe that he operated along the lines of the paradigm of the Logos incarnate, and therefore he could not evade reality. So if we keep saying that he just wanted to meet God and therefore everything else was left behind, I don't think we do justice to the Christian side of Clement.
All right. Well, on that note, why don't we go rejoice in the material world in the form of lunch?
Yep.
And
Good
thank you
idea.
for everyone's work.
Thank you.